and before that represented District 5 in the Texas House of Representatives. So again, we are certainly looking forward to having a chance to chat with him. And of course, if you'd like to join the conversation, you can give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. But in addition to broadcasting, as we do on satellite, we also broadcast on Facebook Live. And so if you'd like to leave a message or a question there, I'll certainly pursue that as well. Well, Senator Bryan Hughes was raised in East Texas, graduated first from Tyler Junior College, then the University of Texas at Tyler, went on to Baylor University School of Law, where he received his law degree. He has been known as a number of people have called him the taxpayer champion, as well as Texans for Fiscal Responsibility. Also has won an award for his right to life stand, and an individual that has been a businessman and also is the first member of his family to receive a bachelor's degree. So, Senator Bryan Hughes, welcome to Point of View.
Kirby, thanks for having me on. It's a real blessing.
You have listened to this program for some time. I'd love to get your comments, because the other day you were kind of sharing some of that with me, and I know some of our listeners would appreciate the fact that as an elected representative, you certainly benefited from some of the things that first Marlon Maddox and now I have been able to communicate all these years.
Kirby, I certainly have. Back when I was in high school some years ago, back in the 1980s, there was a wonderful godly man at my church who was a great influence on me, and he turned me on to Marlon Maddox and the Point of View. And in fact, I recall during that time, maybe in the early 90s, Marlon Maddox wrote a book. I think it was Free Speech or Propaganda, about the national media bias. I bought that book, devoured that. Somewhere along that time, I was enjoy listening to you on when you were with Probe Ministries, or that was what I first was aware of you doing, and obviously coordinating with Marlon Maddox. But then I got to meet Marlon Maddox at the National Affairs briefing, not the one back in 1980, but the one they had, I guess, sort of a follow-up in the 1990s. It was also happened to be the first time I heard David Barton speak. And so a lot of those influences the Lord used to get me involved in the process. I certainly have Point of View and you and Marlon Maddox and all the folks that support that work. I owe a great debt to.
Well, thank you so much. I just thought we might share that because you came up and said that specifically. And one of the things that we have been doing is kind of getting our listeners, especially in the state of Texas, but I know some others listening around the country, even this hour, for the fact that legislative sessions begin in January. And you're going to have a chance to gear up and have a different kind of playing field. Now, you have lost a few, I think, very outstanding conservative senators, but still, by and large, one of the things that I have always said is Texas is just the opposite of the United States. We oftentimes talk about, when you look at Congress, very good pieces of legislation in the House go to die in the Senate. It's been just the opposite in Texas. You've had some very good pieces of legislation in the Senate that go to die in the House. And the reason isn't that you don't have good conservative legislators in the Texas House, but up until recently, you had a Speaker of the House that didn't allow some of those particular pieces of legislation to come to a vote. The new Speaker, and this, of course, is just assuming, but the new Speaker looks very different than the old Speaker. That seems like good news for some of the legislation that you've been working on.
Kirby, I really think it is. Dennis Bonnen, a very experienced state rep from the Lake Jackson, Brazoria County area, so down on the Gulf Coast, right below Houston, was elected to the House as a very young man in his 20s, and been in the House right at 20 years. You look at his voting record and look at any scorecard. Certainly, if you look at pro-life issues, look at fiscal issues, he's got a consistent conservative voting record, and so that's very encouraging. Very smart guy, knows the rules, knows procedure, he knows the policy issues very well. And it's also encouraging to all of us as conservatives that Representative Bonnen found his support in the Speaker race in the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Of course, as Speaker, he'll serve the whole state and each member of the House. But we should all be pleased that his initial support came from the center-right, really the conservatives in the Texas House, and then expanded out from there. And so, yes, we are optimistic. We have a conservative House in Texas. There's no need for the Speaker to ram through conservative legislation. We have a conservative House, and if the rules work like they should and the people of Texas are able to affect their will through the legislature, then we're going to see conservative bills moving through the House as well as the Senate. So we're very optimistic.
Let's, if we can, just before we take a break, mention some of the things that we'll talk about after the break. And one of that is you are certainly known for the right to life issue. And some people, I think, after we come back from the break, are going to be saying, okay, what kind of issues possibly could be addressed there? And so that's the first issue. Then, of course, I mentioned the fact that you're the first member of your family to get a bachelor's degree. And so that kind of gets us thinking about the subject of education and the funding of education and how that's kind of playing out right now in the state of Texas. And, of course, we also have that relates very much to the issue of taxation and a couple of other issues that I know you've been dealing with. And, of course, I know you've also been involved in what's oftentimes been referred to derisively as the bathroom bill, but the whole issue of privacy and things of that nature. So we are going to continue our conversation with Senator Bryan Hughes. And one of the things I would encourage you to do is to take a little bit of time and find out more about him, even if you don't live in that particular district. We have a link to his website, and it gives you some information about what he is involved with. And he has been known for some time as kind of being the pro-life whip in the Texas House. So we'll come back and talk about some of those issues. And then more recently, we now have these videos coming out about non-citizens voting in Texas. And one of the state senators we've had in here before, Don Huffines, who unfortunately will not be in the next session, pointed out that we have a problem with that, of people that are not citizens actually voting in these elections. And I know Bryan Hughes has some comments about that as well. So we have a lot to cover. We will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Life expectancy for Americans continues to decline. The latest report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention put the bad news in perspective. The researchers say that this is the longest sustained decline in expected lifespan at birth in a century. At the turn of the last century, American men were fighting in World War I, and back home, other Americans were confronting the worst flu epidemic in modern history. Last year, there were more deaths than the previous year. That partially reflects the fact that the nation is growing older and aging, but the focus of our attention should be on the younger age groups that are also dying due to such things as suicide and drug overdoses. If you look at the top 10 leading causes of death, only the cancer rate fell in 2017. There were increases in 7 others: suicides, strokes, diabetes, Alzheimer's, flu and pneumonia, chronic lower respiratory diseases, and unintentional injuries. The greatest concern, at least for me, are the deaths due to despair. The suicide rate has increased over the last few decades for both men and women, but the increase in suicides among men has been even more dramatic. Along with that has been the significant increase in the number of deaths due to drug overdoses. In previous commentaries, I've documented that more Americans die from drug overdoses each year than all the men who died during the entire Vietnam War. Remember that these deaths of despair are taking place during peace and prosperity. We aren't engaged in a major war. We aren't in the midst of a recession. In fact, most Americans are doing much better economically. I believe Christians must preach the gospel like never before and provide hope and an eternal perspective to so many Americans who may be the next death of despair statistics. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Senator Bryan Hughes for a few more minutes, an individual that represents the 1st District in the state of Texas in the Texas Senate, and an individual that is certainly known for his pro-life convictions. And so, Senator Hughes, let's just for a minute talk about that. Are there some other things that might happen in this upcoming legislative session that would be of interest to some of our pro-life listeners?
Kerby, thanks. I believe there definitely are. The protection of innocent human life, we can't imagine a more fundamental role for the government, for us as a society. For me, and I bet for many of our listeners, that's what got us into politics. That's why we're engaged. And so, yes, we've done some great work in Texas taking money away from Planned Parenthood and away from entities that provide elective abortions. But still, there are areas in the budget where the money is still finding its way, not directly paying for abortions, but going to those groups or to their affiliates, right? And we understand it's sort of a shell game. If they're allowed to get money from the state, that frees up other funds that they can use for those abortions. And so this legislative session, we believe we will be able to completely defund Planned Parenthood. Also, there's going to be a bill, I believe Senator Kelly Hancock is going to be carrying, that has to do with discrimination. That is to say, in the area of abortion, we know, for example, that little girls in the womb get aborted at a higher rate than little boys. We also know that babies with disabilities have a much greater risk of being aborted in their mother's womb. And so we're going to have an important bill that deals with that. We're trying to focus on the little baby in the mother's womb. When she's there growing in her mother's womb, helpless, ought to be the most safe place on the earth. And so we're going to do everything we can to make sure that's the case in Texas.
So again, some great opportunities there. Let's, if we can, also talk about a couple of issues as well. I mentioned just in passing the fact that we've had Senator Don Huffines, and he will not be joining you again in the Senate. He lost in his election, but he's been on the program with us in the past talking about the fact that we have non-citizens voting. Well, Project Veritas has gone and done a lot of these undercover videos of election officials and all sorts of things and Planned Parenthood and the rest. Well, the latest video coming out just documents what we already knew, and that is an undercover video explaining how so many individuals who are not citizens are actually voting. Now, when we talk with Don Huffines, a lot of that was self-revealed, where when somebody is called for jury duty, say in the Dallas County area, they say, well, I don't have to serve on jury because they click, check the box that say I'm not a citizen. And they go back and say, well, wait a minute, you just voted in the last election. We've had some people voting since 1980 as non-citizens. Is there something the legislature could do to prevent this situation in which you obviously have non-citizens voting in some of these very important elections?
Well, Kerby, there is. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who you know, a solid conservative, shares these values. He appointed a select committee on election integrity. And I was honored when he named me chairman of that committee. Senator Huffines is on that committee as well. And so we heard some testimony, have done a lot of research and investigation around the state. And so cleaning up our voter rolls, making sure that those registered to vote are actually citizens who are entitled to vote. That's one of the main challenges we face. There's going to be a bill during this legislative session that beefs up that verification process so that when people register to vote, we're able to verify citizenship on the front end. That's the first step. As part of this bill, Kerby, we're also going to have paper backup.
Yes.
Folks who vote electronically need to know that if there's a need for a recount, if we want to make sure things were done right, there needs to be a paper trail, a verifiable paper trail. And, Kerby, I've been filing bills since 2005 pushing for paper verification for Texas elections, and we're optimistic it's going to happen now. Believe it or not, in America, 60% of voters are voting on paper backup machines. 60% of Americans. So this is one area, a rare area where Texas is way behind. So we're optimistic about getting paper backup. Also, continuing to crack down on voter fraud, mail-in ballots, right? Those mail ballots are an important convenience to offer people. They're also an opportunity for fraud, and so we're going to see some work there as well.
Again, I got to love all of you guys out there in East Texas. We have Louis Gomert here. Sometimes he even sits in this chair doing the show. And the two of you have really done a very good job of addressing some of those issues. And again, as I've said on this program many times before, when I go to an ATM machine, I expect that when I push a button, that on the screen will be that button, not the opposite one. And we've had problems with people pushing Ted Cruz and up comes Beto O'Rourke or something like that. Or that at the end of my ATM situation, I can get a receipt, like you said, paper ballot. So just some of the things that we have expected for years in dealing with our money, but we have not had in terms of dealing with our vote. So I appreciate that, and we'll be watching those very important pieces of legislation in the legislature. But talk for just a minute, since we're a little tight on time. Education funding, and property tax. These are some of the big issues that my listeners are concerned about. What do you think might happen in the next legislative session?
And Kirby, those issues are all tied together. I think we recognize that money spent on public education needs to be spent wisely, efficiently, and go to the best place. And every study has confirmed what we already know. The best thing we can do for a child in public schools is to put them in a classroom with a good teacher. We are blessed to have good teachers, great teachers in Texas. If we look at the increased spending in education over the last several years, the majority of that has not gone to our teachers. And so
yes,
I believe, right, so you're going to see this session a focus on driving that money to the classroom, in particular teacher pay. And we're looking at what other schools are doing around the state. We have some schools that are getting remarkable success with some students that have a lot of challenges. And so we're looking at what those schools are doing so we can replicate that around the state. So what you're going to see is more of a commitment from the state to support the funding so that we can lower local property taxes. And all the while, the new funding, the new state funding going to public schools is going to be focused in the classroom, in particular in the area of teacher pay.
And again, I might just mention, as people go to your website, first of all, they'll see that, of course, as you mentioned a minute ago, you were the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Election Security, vice chair of State Affairs. Also, of course, there's the Senate Select Committee on Cybersecurity. We've been talking about education. One other one, you sit on the Committee on Criminal Justice. And again, another one of those individuals, which unfortunately will not be with you in the next session, who I've had on this program, Connie Burton, Senator Burton. She said, I didn't start to work on the issue of criminal justice, but I began to realize that's really an important issue. And a lot of people are saying that is the issue right now. The Senate in the House of Representatives has already passed a bill. It's now in front of the U.S. Senate for what's called the First Step Act. But in many cases, what it's attempting to do federally are some of the lessons you've already learned in the state of Texas in terms of sentencing reform and criminal justice reform.
Kirby, that's exactly right. The national media likes to paint Texas as this place where everyone's in prison, and we have these real problems like that. But in fact, Texas, starting about 10 years ago, began a trend that other states are beginning to follow, and we looked at who we're locking up and why. And so realizing that it costs a lot of money to put someone in prison, right? We want to be wise with the taxpayer dollars. And so the principle we're trying to apply is if we're afraid of someone, if they're a threat, we're going to lock them up. If we're mad at someone, they've committed a crime, but it's not a violent crime, it's not going to be a threat to society, let's find a way to put those people to work, paying restitution for their victims. Let's keep them in the community if it's safe. Get them some help if they need it. Get some counseling if they need it. Get some mental health help, some drug help if they need it. Violent criminals, folks who are a threat, we're going to lock those people up. Other folks should not be clogging up our prisons and costing the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. So we're trying to be smart about this. And, Kirby, we're also looking at redemption and second chances.
Yes.
If I've messed up, I've made a mistake, that's fine. If I've cured that and I'm trying to do the right thing and trying to walk the way I should be, we want to honor that. We don't want folks to be doomed because of one bad choice they've made. Of course, we're talking about nonviolent crimes.
Sure. But we're talking about redemption and restoration. Isn't that the Christian message? And over the last couple of months, we've had a chance to meet some people that did some really stupid things in their life, but you wouldn't know it if they hadn't told you because they're fine, upstanding citizens. So we need more of that. Well, Senator Bryan Hughes, I know you've got to head on, and we've got other activities to focus on, but I hope we can call on you again because you certainly are dealing with a lot of issues we are concerned about every day here on Point of View. So I look forward to the next opportunity.
Thankful for your work and honored to be on the program.
We will do it again. Senator Bryan Hughes, when we come back, I'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the national news, and then we'll be talking with J. Warner Wallace. All that coming up right after this.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Visit pointofview.net and invest to help us enter 2019 strong. If you're not quite ready, please pray and get ready to make your next bold move. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about a couple of issues in the news. And then I would, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, look forward to, and I'm looking forward to, the time we're going to spend with J. Warner Wallace, author of a number of excellent books. He used to be a cold case homicide detective, and you probably have seen him on television. And then after he became a Christian, really got interested in the whole area of apologetics. Now actually is a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. He's also an adjunct professor of apologetics at Biola University and a number of others. But if you ever watched NBC Dateline, you probably are familiar with him. And because of his interest as an investigator, he's applied some of those same tools to the whole area of the reliability of the Bible and the deity of Jesus Christ and a variety of others. And we're going to be talking about with him also something new that just came out in Town Hall today, how media consumption threatens the future of Christianity. And then in parentheses, it's not what you think. And that is certainly the case. And it comes from some of the studies that have come out about how especially the younger generation, that millennial generation we talk about on Wednesdays with Nick Pitts, consumes media differently and what that might mean. And so we'll talk about that for sure. And then, of course, we'll also, a little bit later in the third hour, have Overman with us, Christian Overman. He is, of course, with Worldview Matters, been on with us a couple of times. We've talked about the Muslim mindset. Why have Muslims been more effective in Indonesia than Christians have? And then his newest blog, which also is really insightful, and that is, why is it that in so-called Christianized Africa, it really isn't making much of a difference? And a lot of it has to do with the idea that in many of these places, the missionaries brought what you might call a truncated worldview, a truncated gospel that said, well, the gospel relates to your personal salvation, and it does. But the gospel relates to developing a world and life view, a Christian worldview. And so I just, again, appreciate some of the work he's done over the years, and so we'll have him on in the third hour. But let me talk about Robert Mueller and the special counsel investigation for just a few minutes. This comes from our friends at the Wall Street Journal. I don't talk about this much for a couple of reasons. First of all, we don't have the report. So all we could be doing is speculating about something we don't know very much about. And we even had a caller on Friday call in and was critical of the fact that we were making conclusions based upon actually no evidence. And what Kelly Shackelford was saying at the time was, look, we don't know what's in the report, but we can be critical of the way the report was put together, how indeed Robert Mueller brought people to the table, the kind of people he selected, the lack of, if you will, neutrality in some of that. But I understand that there is a sense in which you have to wait, or as they used to say in the West, keep your powder dry. So, okay, I understand that. So we don't talk about it too much for that reason alone. That's reason enough. Reason number two is, if you want to have a day after day after day drumbeat about the Mueller investigation, you can tune into a lot of other programs. And I just think there's a lot of other things that affect you, your faith, your family, and your freedom, besides what are being speculative comments right now about the Mueller investigation. That being said, there have been a few things happen over the weekend that are at least worth a mention. That's what you're going to get from me here. And I think the editors at the Wall Street Journal did a good job of summarizing it, because I said last week was supposed to be the earth-shaking in Robert Mueller's special counsel probe with the release of sentencing memos on 3 former members of the Trump universe. And that would be Michael Flynn, by the way, who's been on the program with us before, Paul Manafort, and Michael Cohen. Yet Americans learned little new and nothing decisive about the allegations of the Russia-Trump collusion investigation, which is, again, why we don't spend a lot of time talking about it. But here's their point. The main Russia-related news is the disclosure in Mr. Mueller's memo on Mr. Cohen, and this would be, again, Michael Cohen, the lawyer for Donald Trump, of previously unknown attempts by an unidentified Russian to reach out to the Trump presidential campaign. This supposedly happened in and around November 2015. Cohen received some contact information and the rest. Now, the bottom line is, I can digress from the piece that the Wall Street Journal put out for just a minute, is if Mr. Cohen was talking to Russians at Trump Tower, or if President Trump, then candidate Trump, was doing so. There's really nothing illegal about that. Maybe nothing more than the kind of business that a person who has international interest would do every single day. So anyway, the point they make in about the fourth paragraph, I'll jump ahead, is so a Russian wanted to insinuate himself into the Trump orbit, but nothing happened. And so the question they ask is, why drop this in the sentencing memo? The press is breathing heavily that it signals Mr. Mueller's intention to promote a narrative that the Trump people were all too willing for commercial and political reasons to hear Russian solicitations. And, of course, you remember one where you had Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner, who had this meeting at Trump Tower back in June of 2016. Nothing came of it as well. Probably shouldn't have taken the meeting, but, that's hindsight as well. So they point out that, if anything, the memo is troubling in that Mr. Manafort lied about his contacts with a Ukrainian business partner, but the memo redacts the details about it, so it's impossible to know if that concerns Russia or the tax violations. And so the only other issue that kind of surfaces from some of this is what, again, the editors call the more legally troubling is the separate sentencing memo on Mr. Cohen. That would, again, be Michael Cohen, who is the lawyer for Donald Trump from the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Mr. Mueller handed off the probe into Mr. Cohen's business practices, including a legal payoff to porn actress Stormy Daniels and other women who claimed to have had affairs with Donald Trump and threatened to go public during the 2016 campaign. Now, the first thing you point out there is, first of all, this is another example, I hate to borrow from a film, of Dumb and Dumber. But since most voters already knew Mr. Trump had a history with women, that's a nice way of saying it, or like the ladies, another nice way of saying it, then the bottom line is even trying to pay off Stormy Daniels makes no sense at all, because as they point out, during 2016, there were people critical of Hillary Clinton spending years apologizing for the behavior of her husband. But again, if you see this as the smoking gun, and some Democrat lawyers and legislators seem to, that this would be enough for an impeachment proceedings, I doubt it. They remind us, trying to make sure that people breathing heavy and looking for something, that at best this would be a campaign violation, and I doubt it even qualifies as that. But okay, let's assume that it is. Those are treated as civil matters, not criminal violations, and the Justice Department has actually dropped similar kinds of charges against people like John Edwards. You might remember him. Matter of fact, the movie about him right now is in the news for 2012 payments to his mistress. So, again, you already have kind of there when it gets down to it. So they finally say the memo waxes on about the importance of campaign finance laws to American democracy, which suggests that indeed there might be some attempt to indict Donald Trump if he could. Justice Department guidelines advise against indicting a sitting president. So the memo looks more like a roadmap for House Democrats to do so. And so we'll see where it goes. But that's kind of what we have so far. Sentencing memos that affect three individuals, Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, and Michael Cohen. So that's what we know. And to be honest with you, we don't know that much. And that's why we don't talk about it very often. Let me get into another issue, which I thought was kind of interesting. And this comes from our good friend Robert Knight. Going to need to probably get him on again before the end of the year. And he says, over the past few decades, secularists and leftists have mounted an aggressive effort to suppress Christianity's historical and current importance in America and place all religions or no religion on the same level. And he points out that there's a new survey that just come out that indicates that they have been wildly successful. For example, city dwellers, young people and women, are far more supportive of Muslims than of Christians. 68% of Democrats said employers should grant a request for prayer space for Muslims, while only 45% said employers should grant a similar request for Christians. One area in which cultural levelers haven't had much success is suppressing Christianity is the evidence of holiday, the Christian holiday, abounds in airports, hotel lobbies, on radio and television, people's yards, and certainly in stores. Even non-Christians get into the spirit. And so he says the multicultural spoil sports can't keep the festivities down except in the public schools, where they make sure children are not exposed to timeless Christmas carols that stir the heart, or in some cases, even red and green napkins. And so when we come back from the break, I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because what we have are the attempts in some of the public schools to actually close those down. And I remember years ago when Kelly Shackelford, in not this studio, not the studio before that, but a previous studio, that's how far back this goes, talking about in one particular school district, they wouldn't even allow Santa Claus, they wouldn't even allow red and green napkins. Well, it's happened again, and you would think it's got to be a joke by now. I wish it were. We'll take a break. We'll talk a little bit more about that and the attempt for a war on Christmas. Doesn't seem to be working very well, but we'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Jonas Yoder was a member of the Old Order Amish living in the state of Wisconsin. Yoder and others lived carefully according to their religious tradition in a community with other Amish and away from the influence of the modern world. After the 8th grade, Old Order Amish school children do not continue to high school where much is taught in variance with their Amish way of life. Instead, the children return to the home where they are instilled with the virtues of goodness, wisdom, and community welfare by their family. But these families ran into a problem as they sought to live out their religion that had motivated their families since the 16th century. The state of Wisconsin required students to attend school through at least the high school age of 16. Yoder's case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States that held that the state of Wisconsin could not compel these Amish families to send their children to high school. According to the court, only those interests of the highest order and those not otherwise served can overbalance legitimate claims to the free exercise of religion. Wisconsin v. Yoder was among the first cases that helped articulate an important balancing test that weighed a state's interest in governing against an individual's right to the free exercise of religion. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes, let me just mention at the top of the hour, we're going to have J. Warner Wallace with us, and I'm looking forward to that interview because of all his work in investigative reports as well as an apologist, and even his recent understanding of how media consumption threatens the future of Christianity. So looking forward to that. But again, just quoting real quickly, just before we get into that interview, Robert Knight talking about this survey that was done that showed that 68%, or basically two-thirds of Democrats, said that employers should grant a request for prayer space for Muslims, but only 45%, less than half, said that employers should grant a similar request by Christians. And I want to get into the rest of the article, but just digress for just a minute to get to something I'm going to talk about in the third hour today. And this is by George Yancey. He is a professor at the University of North Texas, been on the program with us before. Probably time to get him back on because he has a new book called Prejudice in the Press. And what they were studying, and I'll get into this more in the third hour when we have another half hour where I can kind of cover some of that. They did, I think, an interesting kind of study to see how the press would cover different articles. And so they had one story that concerned the shooting of worshipers inside a religious building. And half of the respondents were told it was a church. The other half were told it was a mosque. Then they had another scenario where a professor was making some hateful comments. One were Christophobic, the other were homophobic. What they found is there's no fake news. In other words, both of the institutions on both sides covered the stories, but they didn't cover them the same. In other words, if indeed it had to do with a shooter and it was in a mosque, they focused on the whole question of hate crimes and religious bigotry. If the story was about the church, they paid more attention to the shooter. If the professor was making anti-gay, homophobic statements, again, they put the spotlight on hate speech. But if it was a person making anti-Christian statements, the media framed it in terms of their free speech rights. So there is, I think, just this interesting kind of bias that says we will support Muslims, even if we might disagree with some of their views, simply because they're seen as a minority, and we will discount almost any request by Christians because, after all, we see them in power. And that's exactly what you find here. On the one hand, you have these stories now coming out once again of principals and others saying, we are just going to have a holiday celebration or a winter celebration, and we can't certainly have anything about Christmas carols, but we can't even have red and green napkins. We can't have Santa Claus. And I like what Robert Knight says. He says, in the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis describes the bleak Narnian landscape as always winter but never Christmas. That sounds like school winter concerts that have replaced Christmas celebrations. He says today's cultural vandals look back for inspiration in the 20th century. In the atheist Soviet Union, the communists got rid of St. Nicholas and replaced him with a grandfather Frost, which I did not know. 1938, when Germany's Nazis annexed Austria, one of the first things they did was to ban Christmas observations in public schools. As Maria von Trapp of the Sound of Music fame recounts, one of her children saying, in school, we are not permitted to sing any religious songs with the name of Christ or Christmas. We can hardly sing any Bach for that reason. Some of the pressure to downplay Christmas in America comes from what Robert Knight calls grinchily atheists, but some of the work of liberals terrified of offending immigrants from predominantly Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhist countries. What else in the world do countries willingly shed their cultural heritage so that newcomers won't be offended? Well, okay, Europe, he says. That kind is trying to live down its Christian past so fast that, as Mark Stein has chronicled, Eurabia can rise in its place. But even though Islamic doctrine opposes much of the liberal social agenda, progressives have elevated it and other religions as a wedge against their real foe, and that is Christianity. One of the arguments being made by Breitbart's Neil Monroe is, for example, the arrival of a small Muslim group in a large Christian-populated town allows Democrats to argue that religious equality requires the cultural visibility of Christianity to be reduced at the same level as Islam. And so following public backlashes, he says, in California and Virginia over the introduction of Islamic concepts in public schools, defenders of the practice insisted that a well-rounded education include comparative religion. And he says the same thing I would say. Not a bad idea, but it's not the same as honestly teaching the importance of the Bible and Christianity to America's history and government structure. You really can't understand America without it. Robert Knight goes on to say, all too often offering comparative religion has meant pretending that all religions teach the same thing. In Georgia, for example, a 2015 sample classroom guide said that Islam, Christianity, and Judaism share the same God, which is patently false. In Staunton, Virginia, a high school session on comparative religion had students copy in calligraphy the Shahada, the Islamic statement of faith, which says there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet or messenger. In Illinois, the Satanic Temple of Chicago got permission this year to erect a sculpture. Maybe you've seen that, stepping on Christmas, placed near a nativity, a Christmas tree, and a menorah in the Illinois Capitol's rotunda is an edifice. It depicts, if you've seen this, a snake wrapped around a woman's hand as she holds an apple. It makes Satan the hero for promising that if Adam and Eve ate forbidden fruit, it would render them like gods, knowing good and evil. And if you haven't seen that statue, matter of fact, almost all the pictures people have taken of it that I've seen, because it's so dark and the rotunda is so dark, you can hardly see it anyway. But nevertheless, that's the Satanic Temple of Chicago, which has its little nativity of sorts right there in the rotunda in the Illinois Capitol in Springfield. But again, also in the rotunda is a sign that says, religion is but myth and superstition that hardens hearts and enslaves minds. That would be news to the Christians who led the fight against slavery, fought for civil rights, ended child labor, founded hospitals, and advanced the concept of mercy in a very cold world. Nevertheless, he ends by saying, since this kind of detail is absent from most school history books, the results of the survey that he just mentioned should not come as a surprise, nor the official acceptance of a satanic sculpture as morally equivalent to a Christmas creche or a nativity creche. The good news is that despite all their efforts to snuff them out, the lights sparkling in the commercial splendor and on front lawns all across America still point to a baby born 2,000 years ago who brought God's love for humanity into startling bright focus. And that is Robert Knight's piece that appeared today in the Washington Times. If you want to get a sense of the hostility to some of those ideas, all you have to do is probably log in right now to the Washington Times, find his piece, look at the letters to the editor or even the comments, and you will be amazed that that particular comment generates so much negative response. Probably some attaboys as well. But nevertheless, Robert Knight's been with us on a number of occasions, and I just thought that I would read that to you today, but also use that as a setup for the conversation we'll have a little bit later, because I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, the anti-Christian media bias, which has been well documented in this new book by Dr. George Yancey. And then while we're talking about some of the bias, also get into just a couple of really wrong-headed things that have been said lately by David Hogg. You might remember him from the Parkland shooting. And, of course, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Not trying to make fun of them, but simply saying that when they keep spreading so much misinformation, it's just helpful every once in a while to tell you what really is true and to do a little bit of a fact check. Last time they did a fact check on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she got 4 Pinocchios. On the one I'm going to be talking about today, maybe only 2 Pinocchios, but still not as accurate as you'd like it to be. Let's take a break, though. We've got a lot more to cover. J. Warner Wallace with us right after these important messages.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Visit pointofview.net and invest to help us enter 2019 strong. If you're not quite ready, please pray and get ready to make your next bold move. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you've been listening to Point of View any length of time, you know that one of our missions here is the whole area of worldview and apologetics. We want you to be able to articulate a biblical worldview and also know how to defend a biblical worldview, which is, of course, what apologetics is all about. So this is one of the reasons why this hour we wanted to focus some time and attention on the good work being done by J. Warner Wallace. Perhaps you've seen some of his books, Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, and you perhaps have heard him on this program talking about some of those books, and you perhaps remember that he has worked for many years as a cold case homicide detective and an individual that perhaps you even watched on NBC Dateline. Well, he's taken those same kind of investigative looks and really begun to apply that to this area of apologetics, and today serves not only as a speaker on various campuses and in various churches and other venues, but also has been the senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, individual that is an adjunct professor of apologetics at Biola University, and of course oftentimes speaks at Summit Ministries, and just a good friend. And so J. Warner Wallace, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, I'm so glad to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Let's, if we can, actually start with something that you've written that appears in Town Hall. How media consumption threatens the future of Christianity. In parentheses, it's not what you think. And the point you're making here is that many Christian leaders are rightly concerned about the kind of moral message, or maybe I could even call it immoral message, being presented right now. Movies, television, commercials, and other things, which are contrary to the teachings of the Bible. But you want to focus on an issue that we sometimes talk about in our millennial roundtable. We get a group of millennials here. I'm kind of the token non-millennial. And we've pointed out that the way in which the younger generation consumes information, news, and entertainment is something that should concern us as well. Explain.
Yeah, I'm actually fascinated by the way that technology either helps or hinders our communication process, and how we look at Christianity, how we look at any worldview, how we even consider political issues. I mean, to me, this is so fascinating to see just that it's not so much that, yes, you're right, we have these moral messages that are being sent to us that are very different than the biblical messages. I get that. But what's really interesting to me, and I just got done writing a book with Sean McDowell on teaching Christian worldview to Gen Z. Now, Gen Z are those kids maybe 3 to 18, 3 to 20, in that range, high schoolers, junior hires, elementary school kids who are coming up now as digital natives. So unlike you and I, we are digital immigrants. We came to the smartphones that we hold in our hands every day late in life. But these kids have never remembered a time in which smartphones did not play an important role in the lives of even their parents, right? They were watching their parents with smartphones. So this is a different generation altogether. And what I've noticed, and it's been pretty well documented, are a couple of things. Number one, the technology I call this now the technology of choice, is that what technology has done before, and more than anything else, is it has opened up for us the entire field of choices. And in a culture that is wired toward, and we are as fallen humans wired toward personal autonomy anyway, we don't want to be told who we should be and what we should do. We want to be autonomous. Well, this technology allows us to do that in our media consumption. You remember, when I was growing up with you, and you're probably the same age as I am, when we were growing up, If you missed a television show you really wanted to see, well, they made 26 episodes, and then they ran the second season as repeats. And you might have to, if you didn't catch it on Thursday night, you wouldn't see it again for another 6 months. And if you missed it that time, you might not see it until it gets to repeats and, it's syndicated, in which case it might take you a year to see it or 2 years to see that episode. You had no recourse. You couldn't go find it anywhere else. You missed the episode, you missed it. Now, that's not the case now. As a matter of fact, everything, more than anything else, the technology has created an on-demand appetite in the minds of young people that if they had to wait to see it at only a particular time, forget about that. I mean, I can get whatever I want, whenever I want it, however I want it, and I can display it on my phone. And now what that's done is it has given us the ability to, and by the way, there are so many choices. So now it used to be if you didn't have a show on one of the top 3 networks, you didn't have a show on NBC, ABC, or CBS, you didn't have a show. But now you've got every other network competing for the shows that used to be only on the top 3. Not only that, Netflix, Hulu are making original series, and most recently, Facebook is starting to make original series that will be aired on Facebook. So you've got choices now. And that means that instead of having 20 detective shows you could watch, you've got 200 you could watch. And if you don't like the guy or the gal who holds a worldview on one of those shows, you can just select the shows with people who hold the exact same worldview as you. There's enough variety out there now that you can actually select and insulate yourself and just kind of have the repeating mantra of your worldview in all of your media choices, all of your news choices, all of your social media interaction. And what this means for us is we believe as Christians that there is an overarching meta-narrative called Christianity, but it turns out all of our young people are being raised with the ability to insulate themselves from overarching worldviews and only amplify in their own ears and in their own eyes whatever worldview that they are enjoying, whatever worldview that they want to affirm. In other words, this technology of choice has created an environment in which young people can create their own micro-narratives and insulate themselves from any meta-narratives. And that's the problem, I think, for anyone who is trying to argue for a meta-narrative, whether it's Christianity or Marxism or capitalism or whatever it may be. If you're trying to argue for a meta-narrative, well, good luck with that, because you probably can't even get it in front of the people you're trying to argue it for, because they're probably watching something else that they chose personally.
Well, again, it's like the problem we've talked about in terms of silos. You have individuals that, for example, only watch Fox News, individuals that only watch MSNBC. So whether you're young or adult, you can see that problem has caused a great deal of political division. But back to the key point that you're making here, if you are creating your own micro-narrative and you're only watching those things you want to watch, and maybe even only believing the things that you post on your Twitter feed or on your YouTube channel that you might have created or something else, it's not that you're listening to and thus rejecting an alternative worldview. You're not hearing or seeing it in the first place. So that's the first issue. We need to take a break, though. When we come back, I want to talk about the other, which sounds contradictory, but it isn't. By this generation also being exposed to more different worldviews, philosophies, beliefs, and other things, how is that affecting even the issue of commitment? Because if there's one thing we learned from sociology, I grew up, and some of my degrees are in science. I always love in science because you have laws. And we really don't have laws in social science. But if there's a law in social science, it's this. As choice increases, commitment decreases. And so when you are confronted by this pluralistic view of all these different worldviews, how is that affecting our ability to communicate the gospel? And so this is one of the very excellent pieces written by J. Warner Wallace, How Media Consumption Threatens the Future of Christianity. And that one appeared today in Town Hall. By the way, just for your benefit, I also posted one of his blog posts on Are Mental States Merely Brain States, and also a link to his website. So we'll spend some time talking with him. And, of course, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join the conversation. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Life expectancy for Americans continues to decline. The latest report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention put the bad news in perspective. The researchers say that this is the longest sustained decline in expected lifespan at birth in a century. At the turn of the last century, American men were fighting in World War I, and back home, other Americans were confronting the worst flu epidemic in modern history. Last year, there were more deaths than the previous year. That partially reflects the fact that the nation is growing older and aging, but the focus of our attention should be on the younger age groups that are also dying due to such things as suicide and drug overdoses. If you look at the top 10 leading causes of death, only the cancer rate fell in 2017. There were increases in 7 others: suicides, strokes, diabetes, Alzheimer's, flu and pneumonia, chronic lower respiratory diseases, and unintentional injuries. The greatest concern, at least for me, are the deaths due to despair. The suicide rate has increased over the last few decades for both men and women, but the increase in suicides among men has been even more dramatic. Along with that has been the significant increase in the number of deaths due to drug overdoses. In previous commentaries, I've documented that more Americans die from drug overdoses each year than all the men who died during the entire Vietnam War. Remember that these deaths of despair are taking place during peace and prosperity. We aren't engaged in a major war. We aren't in the midst of a recession. In fact, most Americans are doing much better economically. I believe Christians must preach the gospel like never before and provide hope and an eternal perspective to so many Americans who may be the next death of despair statistics. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with J. Warner Wallace, who again is a cold case homicide detective, but now an individual working so much in the area of apologetics. The article I just mentioned a minute ago, how media consumption threatens the future of Christianity, and it isn't just the message, but also the more than just the content, but even the way it's being consumed, that it would be hard to understand a meta-narrative if you have this own kind of self-directed micro-narrative. But I wanted to at least put one more issue on the table, Warner, and that is the issue of pluralism. Pluralism has always been around ever since we've certainly gone through the Protestant Reformation, and so there have been different worldviews, and whether it's the Protestant Reformation or the Enlightenment or even the 20th and 21st century proliferation of worldviews. But we are, as a younger generation, and all of us, being exposed to more and more worldviews, and it seems to me that also explains one of the reasons why people have trouble with things like the exclusivity of Christ or others, because they just say, I just know so many different worldviews, they can't all be right, and so after a while they start believing that none of them are right, or they're all right in the sense that it's personally true for them. And that's affected our ability to share the gospel, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, what's interesting about doing some of this research we did for this book on Gen Z is that we are definitely in an information age. So there's some benefits to that, right? We have access to information we didn't have before. The problem is, though, if you go online and you search a number of websites, is that what we see in young people is an increased confidence they can get any answer they're looking for, but a decreased trust level
yes.
in the source of the information, and I can understand why that would be true. Look, I can search on a search engine for any particular topic, and I'm going to get a page of responses. And if I visit all 12 of those websites, they look equally authoritative, right? Okay, it used to be that you got information from one source and you just accepted it or you didn't, but now I've got information from 12 sources and they all look equally authoritative and they're all saying different things. And so what we see is a crisis in trust, and that's what you're absolutely right. Why would I personally commit? I mean, it's clear that there's lots of people out there with different views, and they all seem to have the same level of authority, and they certainly have websites that look equally authoritative. So what do I do with this? And this is why I think there's an opportunity for us as Christians. Sometimes we have a tendency to bang that drum and kind of raise the flag of concern, but there's actually some hope here, and here's why I say that. What really we have to do now is reunify the two things that have been separated, information and trust. And that means that we have to go back to, and this is tough for a lot of an apologist, right, a Christian apologist, and sometimes we get a bad name because there's a sense in which we're always arguing about stuff, and we're kind of arrogant and think we know the answer to stuff, and we're probably more concerned about head issues than heart issues. Well, it turns out with young people, and this is true for every generation, is that it's always truth in the context of relationships. Truth in the context of relationships. You might learn something from a street preacher, but when you learn it from your dad, with whom you have a relationship, or you learn it from a trusted friend with whom you have a relationship, it's a little bit different in the sense that you've restored, because there's skepticism about trust, right, with young people, and we have to kind of bridge that. And so what it really means is we have a responsibility as Christians who have relationships in the world to capitalize on the trust we already have with people to share truth. And we're always going to have more impact in sharing the truth in the world around us if we are doing it in the context of trusted relationships. And so that's why, and by the way, this is true the other way too, because when your kids go to school and they find that they have more relationship with somebody at the university level, say, or in their own culture, in the workplace or whatever, they have more relationship with that person, they have a better sense of trust, then get ready for that person to have a greater influence on their thought life than you're going to have. And so I want to just raise the concern for parents. Yeah, parents should be concerned that this is happening, but at the same time, know this: we are in a position where we could have the most trusted relationship with our kids and to be able to have that voice in their lives. So I think it does give us an opportunity, because this crisis of trust is answerable if we're willing to step in the gap.
And I might just mention that some people say, well, I wish I had the answer to some of the difficult questions that my kids are asking. And that's why I point them to things like coldcasechristianity.com, because you've just got an enormous number of answers to those kinds of questions, which I get the sense sometimes when I read some of the material that you have there that it's sort of focus-driven. One advantage that both of us have, you have it by going and speaking to audiences, and I have by opening up the phones and hearing the questions and comments, is I kind of get the sense that what are kind of some of the hot questions people are asking right now.
That's right.
And then
Right.
It gives me a chance to give some answers, so that if you have that relationship with an individual and they ask you a question, you go, and that's a really good question. I don't have an answer, but I heard this guy, J. Warner Wallace. Let me go to his website, or maybe go to Josh McDowell's website. Let me go to Sean McDowell's website. Let me go to half a dozen others. We'll see what Hank Hanegraaff has to say, what Probe Ministries has to say, whatever it is. And I'll find some of those, and then I'll get back to you. That's all people are really looking for. They don't want you to fake your way through it anyway. And if you are showing an interest in giving an answer, whether it's to a friend, a colleague, or maybe even an individual that is very skeptical about you, just the honest ability to go and find some of that information on your website and other places is a great way to resolve some of the questions that people might have.
Oh, I think you're absolutely spot on. We can't. It's a both and. So what that means is we have to take the time to develop the trust with the people we're trying to reach. But if they don't see us as authoritative on an issue, in other words, as knowing enough about the issue to even answer the question, well, then you only have one half of it again. They trust you that you care about them, but they don't think you really know what you're talking about. So when it comes down to this issue, they may not ask mom or dad. They may not ask this trusted advisor, because they know this is outside their scope. It really is outside. So if somebody makes a claim that's really based in science and tries to kind of tear down a theistic worldview, well, we need, as the trusted advisors, to be authoritative enough so we're marrying the two things. It's trust and information. What they see now is a lot of information and not sure who to trust. But we don't want them to come to us and see all the trust but no information. We have to know enough to be able to help our kids, if for no other reason, because we care about our kids. Be selfish about it. I think it's okay to be selfish about wanting to protect your kids.
I would think so. Let me just mention, too, as people go to your website, they're going to find some really great connections. One of the pieces that you have there is an interview you did with Melissa Kane Travis. I'm going to have her on tomorrow, so it's interesting that I have you on today, have her on tomorrow. And you do connect to other individuals. And, of course, we provide some of that as well. But that kind of brings us into some other issues. First of all, just before we take a break, let's talk about some of the books and resources you have there, because I know that people that are listening probably are very familiar with your book, Cold Case Christianity. But one of the things I really wanted to begin to highlight is that you really have had an outreach to young people. And recently, when I was speaking, even in my Sunday school class, I talked about Cold Case Christianity and God's crime scene. And I have a couple of young kids that actually are in the class with their parents. They'd rather hear me than go to their Sunday school class. So I made sure that I had enough copies of Cold Case Christianity for Kids, and they were just thrilled because they're at an age where sometimes they want to kind of be detectives anyway. And so you have the opportunity that they can earn a certificate of merit and actually be part of the Cold Case Academy. So talk about some of the resources that are available, not just for adults, but for kids, because sometimes I have, Warner, people saying, okay, I appreciate what you guys are doing on Worldview and Apologetics. Do you got anything for grade school kids? You got anything for middle school kids? And the bottom line is you do.
Yeah, we did that on purpose because we knew that the polls are telling us that people are walking away from the faith at a much earlier age. And if you ask in their college years, young ex-Christians, when they first checked out, they will tell you it's between the ages of 10 and 17. So if it's between the ages of 10 and 17, they may not tell you as a parent until they leave to go to college, but if it's between those ages, we need to start there. So we started to take the three books, the three adult books, Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, and Forensic Faith, and we said, okay, we need to make kids' versions. And one thing we've noticed about Gen Z, if you look at the viewing patterns of media consumption of young people, you will find that they are viewing fictional narratives at a far higher rate than they're they're not searching through the news sites. They are actually watching Netflix at an incredibly high rate. I mean, the percentage of online traffic to Netflix is staggering, and it's young people, for the most part, who are watching videos that are narrative. So we knew when we wrote the kids' books, we didn't just want a set of facts books. No, what we did was we created three fictional stories in which a set of young detectives that are learning how to be detectives, they're kids, and they're in a kids' academy for detectives, and they are trying to solve mysteries that have nothing to do with Christianity. They're about a skateboard or about a puppy or about, a box found in an attic. And as they're trying to solve these mysteries, we're going to teach them the principles that'll make the case for Christianity, for God's existence, and show them how to share these things with people around them. But the point was, we knew we had to start with a fictional narrative because that is the primary attractive device, really, of media and culture right now anyway.
Well, we'll come back and talk a little bit more about what's on the website, and then we'll get into one or two of some of the blog posts by J. Warner Wallace. But most importantly, we'll give you a chance to join our conversation. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Visit pointofview.net and invest to help us enter 2019 strong. If you're not quite ready, please pray and get ready to make your next bold move. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you have some thoughts about the way in which young people consume media and also the real challenge that we face in terms of presenting the gospel, or as we've talked about here, this meta-narrative in the 21st century. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you have some specific questions about things you're dealing with right now in terms of apologetics, we have J. Warner Wallace with us, and we would certainly welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Article that he has in Town Hall, which you can find. Of course, it also refers to a very good article that appeared in USA Today talking about how TV viewing is declining among young millennials. And I make a distinction between the millennial generation, the Gen Y, and the iGen generation, or Gen Z, because in some respects, even the millennials, as they oftentimes have said around the table, they are also digital immigrants. I've had one of our in particular participants say, I never had a cell phone until I was almost out of high school. That's very different than some of the very young individuals that grew up with iPads in their lap at a very young age, which, by the way, I don't recommend, but nevertheless is the reality. So if you'd like to join our conversation today, we'd love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We have information at our website, pointofview.net, about J. Warner Wallace. You can follow him on Facebook and on Twitter. And you can also, of course, go to his website, Cold Case Christianity. And just for another minute or two, let's, if we can, Warner, talk about some of the resources that are available to our listeners, whether you're a parent or a child, whether you're a teacher or an educator or pastor. There are just a lot of resources that you've made available on your website.
Yeah, we try to do. Look, I was one of those guys who came to faith late. I was 35 when I first became a Christian, and to be honest, I kind of thought Christians are always selling something, right? I mean, so here we are years later writing books, and I feel like I don't want to be one of those guys, but I get it. I want to reach people with information, and the best and most robust way to do that is in a book. So what we try to do is provide free teaching outlines for any of the books that we write. So if you are interested in teaching apologetics to your group, you can go on our teaching outline page and just take a look at what we offer. And for every book, we've got the PowerPoints, we've got, teaching guides and outlines and short videos that we can. Of course, we're making curriculum as well, but I just want you to be able to have resources you can either marry to the curriculum or marry to the books, so you can actually teach this stuff to your own. And I'll tell you, one of the greatest joys we've had has been at a website we formed called CasemakersAcademy.com.
Right.
And at Casemakers Academy, it's just a kids' academy. So it's just built for kids so they can watch the videos chapter by chapter. They can earn a certificate to become a good detective, and they can go through these mysteries, which are really meant to be fun. And what we've heard back from students, we have an Honor Cadet page there. You can see all the students who have read our books. And if you look at that, you'll see that people they're just excited to solve mysteries, right? Now, in the end, we're going to talk about all the skill set you would use to determine if Christianity is true. But that same skill set could be used to investigate any claim made by culture. So what we're trying to do is teach young people not what to think, but how do they process information? How do they discern what is true based on evidence, those kinds of things. So in the end, we have great confidence that if they become good thinkers, they're still going to be Christians. It's not as though you have to stop learning how to think in order to believe this crazy thing called Christianity. We believe it actually is the most reasonable inference from evidence.
Well, again, the books, Cold Case Christianity, also one, Cold Case Christianity for Kids, God's Crime Scene, and again, one for kids. We also have Forensic Faith, which again is also one for kids. And then, of course, Alive, a cold case approach to the resurrection. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take some of those calls in just a minute. But I also wanted to point to your blog. One of the pieces you posted, which I thought was very helpful, was, are atheists correct when they claim mental states are merely brain states? Now, a number of years ago, Sean McDowell and Jonathan Morrow wrote a book in which they looked at some of the criticisms of atheists, and many of them we've talked about on this program before in terms of intelligent design or whether or not Christianity is a wish fulfillment. But one of those, which I feel like has really sort of taken hold, and if you go to a Barnes & Noble or a bookstop, or you go out even on the internet, you'll see that there are a lot of books and articles being written by individuals that are saying, there is no soul, there is no mind, we are just brain states. And I appreciate the fact that you actually took that on, because I think that's one of the big challenges for us here in the 21st century. I've done a week of radio programs on neurophysics and neuroethics and brain states and things like that, because I think this is a hot issue, and I appreciate the fact that you wrote about it.
Well, I felt like this is one of those 8 pieces of evidence in the universe that has to be explained when I wrote God's Crime Scene. I thought, okay, look, what we do is we enter a crime scene, We ask the question, can I explain everything in the room by staying in the room? And what I mean is, if I can explain everything in the room there's a dead guy in the room, but there's no evidence anyone else has been in the room except for him, well, then I've got a suicide or an accidental. But if I've got evidence that it can only be explained by a suspect that's outside the room, I have to at least consider homicide, right? Because I got evidence of an intruder. So if you took the same approach to the universe and you said, okay, can I explain everything in the universe by staying in the universe? And that means I've only got space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry to work with. Can we explain our experience of mind by staying inside the room with nothing more than space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry? Even atheists like Sam Harris, who is a trained neuroscientist, would say that no, you really can't. That all you can explain is brains. That brains are physical. If you're going to deal with a physical universe that are governed by physical laws, you have to have something physical like a brain to be governed. But immaterial things like mind are not available under that purely materialistic, deterministic, atheist worldview. So he would say that your experience of mind is an illusion. It's illusory. It's not really. It's fooling you into thinking that you actually have this immaterial thing called mind. And you'll see this in the history of philosophy. This thing that's called the problem of mind. And why it's a problem is that we got to figure out, well, how does it emerge? Why is it purely a physical, a shadow of a physical process? Is it something separate than the physical process? And so as we make a case for the existence of minds, believe it or not, we are making a case for the Christian worldview. Yes. Because the Christian worldview offers there are immaterial realities like minds and souls, and the evidence for both, I think, is powerful. And I just wanted to be able to cover that and also show why this material explanation of purely mental, brain states doesn't get it done. And this is why, in the end, if you said, I'm going to only explain the phenomena I experience in the universe with natural laws, space, time, and matter, you're going to end up in a place where you're going to say, well, science can't really explain it, but I trust that someday it will. Mm-hmm. Because right now, science has no explanation for this. And I think it's time for us to at least be honest about that. Nobody would accept us, Kerby, as saying, hey, I don't know how to explain this, but someday God will explain it to me. That would never be allowed. So we can't allow others to say, hey, I don't know how to explain this with just, space, matter, time, and physics, but someday I know there's no God. For sure there's no God. So eventually I think there's going to be a scientific explanation. Really? Well, I'm going to make a decision today. And I ask juries to make a decision today, not based on what they think might emerge in the evidence set 10 years from now. When I present evidence to a jury, I say, look, there is no other evidence but this right now. You can't say, well, they might find something 10 years from now. No, then don't make a decision. He's not guilty, okay? But you have to make the decision based on what's being offered today. And right now, if we stop time and say, what do we know based on science, there's not a lot of answers over there. And so if you're going to make the decision today, I think you make it fairly and say, well, look, everything seems to point to the existence of something that's non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material. It's outside of space, time, and matter. It is a mind that is the source of information in DNA. I mean, things are pointing to a personal, non-spatial, non-material, non-temporal first cause of the universe. And that really sounds like God.
It does. And, of course, the other part of that is that if you say we are only just a meat computer, then everything is determined, and you think you have free will, but you really don't have free will. And, of course, just since you've worked in the criminal justice system, you can't imagine that that's going to be something, well, my brain just made me do it. Or, the example I love to use is, about every 7 years, every atom in your body has been replaced. And so, you could say, Judge, that happened 7 years ago, and so I'm not even the same person that committed that. I've tried to use that on my wife. Something I did 7 years ago, I say, I'm not the same man. It's not working, by the way, Warner, but, it just gives you an illustration of they're just, you don't want to work in that world because then there's no real love, there's no real commitment, there's no real choice. And we are just biological entities walking around fooling ourselves that we have a brain. Good news is the Bible is true, and that's one of the reasons we're talking about it today. Let's take some phone calls, though. I wanted to give some of you a chance to join our conversation, so we'll head first to North Carolina. Andrea, thank you for joining us today. You're on with J. Warner Wallace.
You picked a real heavy one, buddy. Yeah, man, this is heavy. Here I am going back to my hero, Ravi Zacharias. He's my hero. And he has said, I wrote it put it on my fridge,
Let me put you on hold. I was coming to a break anyway. I thought maybe you had a quick question. We'll come back and let you ask the question, and then we'll get an answer from J. Warner Wallace right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Jonas Yoder was a member of the Old Order Amish living in the state of Wisconsin. Yoder and others lived carefully according to their religious tradition in a community with other Amish and away from the influence of the modern world. After the 8th grade, Old Order Amish school children do not continue to high school where much is taught in variance with their Amish way of life. Instead, the children return to the home where they are instilled with the virtues of goodness, wisdom, and community welfare by their family. But these families ran into a problem as they sought to live out their religion that had motivated their families since the 16th century. The state of Wisconsin required students to attend school through at least the high school age of 16. Yoder's case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States that held that the state of Wisconsin could not compel these Amish families to send their children to high school. According to the court, only those interests of the highest order and those not otherwise served can overbalance legitimate claims to the free exercise of religion. Wisconsin v. Yoder was among the first cases that helped articulate an important balancing test that weighed a state's interest in governing against an individual's right to the free exercise of religion. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
J. Warner Wallace with us for a few more minutes. Again, don't forget to go to the website, coldcasechristianity.com. And Andrea, you were asking a question, and we came to one of those mandatory breaks, but I'd like to give you the floor. And what would you like to ask today?
Well, I just wanted to say something to your panel, to the guy. I'm listening very closely. You know, you've heard Robbie, and you know he says, science can tell us what we're doing, but they don't tell us if it's right or wrong to do it. They could tell us exactly what we're doing, but not if it's right or wrong to do it. And then the other thing I put on my refrigerator says, a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings. And he was, of course, saying that we have a disconnect between the head and the heart. This is Robbie now. This is all Robbie. This is not me. And I put it there because I had to think about it. And so I get that. It's a different generation. They are learning in different ways than you and I learned, and you and I probably learned in different ways. And then the other thing is the books that are written, the fictional narratives, because I have two in front of me. One is called Horrid Henry and the Zombie Vampire by Francesca Simon. And it's for about a 9 or 10-year-old that will read, because some won't read. I've mentored kids, and some will not read. Then there's one that I really like. I didn't like Hard Henry and the Zombie Vampire, not because of the title, because I read it in Francesca Simon. It was just popular and dead. Then I read Mary Pope Osborne, The Magic Treehouse, and I loved it. And that was a fictional narrative, so I'm kind of excited about your panel member talking about this, what he's talking about, the books that he's putting out there for the kids. Yeah, I like that.
Well, let's talk about those narratives for just a minute because, first of all, you were talking about, she was talking about feelings, and that you've noticed that. You teach often at Summit Ministries, and, of course, you teach at all sorts of different venues with Stand to Reason and a variety of other organizations, and you can present a logically consistent case, and they'll look at you and go, well, I just don't feel like that's right. And you go, what? So that's the first issue, and then also the importance of narrative. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you're right. There's a danger in trusting our feelings over our heads, or that. So that's been clear in every generation. But what's interesting, though, is the idea that we would learn with our eyes, that we would see. I think that's always been the case, and I think we need to be early adopters of this reality. In the past, Christians have sometimes been late adopters to certain principles. We need to be early adopters here. How many times growing up did you hear seeing is believing? Well, it still is believing. I've worked with juries now since about 1988. And having worked with the juries, I will tell you that I make everything very visual for my jurors. Right. I want to narrate, in essence, what's like an episode of Dateline for the jurors, because once they see it, they go, oh, okay, I get it. It still is true that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And with young people, this is even more pronounced, because the digital native, the one thing that really drives that is they are visual natives, because the thing that's happening in smartphones, it's not about the technology or the speed as much as it's about the visual nature of all the media. So we as Christians, I think, now need to be able to communicate. This is why a lot of what we do on our website, and you've probably seen this on everyone's website, are short videos. And shorter is always better. My podcast used to be an hour and a half, okay? My podcast now is about 28 minutes, okay? And why are we doing that? Because we know that young people have a shortened attention span. Not that they won't watch a 3-hour movie. They will. But the 3-hour movie when I was growing up had a certain number of scenes. The 3-hour movie today has 4 times the number of scenes and camera angles, because they recognize that what's shortening is our visual attention span. And I want to take advantage of that. Our books are entirely illustrated. I don't have a single page on any children's book where we don't illustrate something visual. And of course, I have a background as an illustrator, and I was a designer and an architect before I became a police officer, so I illustrate my own books. But my point is, we want to capitalize on the visual nature of young people. I'm not going to run from that. I'm going to use it to actually make the case.
Well, let's, if we can, just before we run out of time, talk about how people can use some of your resources. And up until now, of course, we've been talking about parents and others, but you have also a monthly Bible insert. And you have some other resources that would be very helpful for pastors, for Sunday school leaders, small group leaders, and others. Talk about some of the material that you have available in that regard.
Well, if I can just make one pitch, right? We're trying to step into a generation that is entirely dependent on their smartphones or their pads. And I will tell you that we designed a phone app, and everyone's done this, right? But we were very, very specific about what we were trying to do. We knew that we needed a phone app that would include short, brief resources. So when someone asks you a question, or you've got your own question, yeah, I could point you to one of our blogs that's 600 words. But to be honest, you're not going to read 600 words. You're only going to read probably about 100. That's what's happening. We've shortened, how many characters are on Twitter? We've shortened the post. How many times do you not click the read more at the bottom of a Facebook post? After that first paragraph, if you can't capture it, forget about it. I'm already moving on to the next post. And this is the nature of young people, and really everyone in our culture is having a shortened attention span. If that's the case, we knew we needed brief resources. Our quick shots on our cold case app are really designed to give you answers in about 100 words. And so the most challenges you're ever going to face, someone's going to ask this question of you, you cannot go on your phone app and scroll through 15 pages of information. You need to get it in one paragraph. And sadly, and we have to be that, by the way, the opposition is rhetorically powerful in one paragraph. We had better learn how to respond in a rhetorically powerful way in one paragraph. And if we can't do that, we're going to lose the battle of rhetoric. And so that's why we wanted to make sure we had a resource out there. You can download that phone app right from our website.
And again, rapid responses to help you really take the next step in understanding some of the objections, as well as case-making cheat sheets to view and save and things like that. Some of the weekly articles, some of the audio podcasts, some of the videos, even a chat room. And so, again, you can just go to your app store and get the Cold Case Christianity app. So that is something that everyone can have. But again, as I mentioned just a minute ago, there's some resources that I think people could begin to use. Let's say you're a children's teacher and you're saying, I'd like to teach them apologetics, but I just don't know how to make it interesting because, as you said, you're an illustrator. By the way, I don't know if you know Todd Hampson, but I love his Nonprofit's Guide to End Times, and he does the same kind of thing, recognizes that visual things in books are really going to be the future.
Absolutely.
And you understand that same concept. So there's some resources we could put in the hands of some people that are saying, you know, I'm looking for the next curriculum to teach my third graders, my fifth graders, my seventh graders, hey, even my high school kids. And you have those kind of resources too, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. Everything that we did on Casemakers Academy, we actually provide as a free download. So what we want is for parents and teachers and Sunday school teachers to have these quick resources. We have a PowerPoint presentation that's entirely visual for every chapter of our kids' books. We know that in the end, if you're going to stand in front of young people who are being trained in a digital environment, you're going to at least at some point have to recognize the visual nature of storytelling. So we know that not everyone's going to be able to illustrate these on their own. I remember I first started teaching Sunday school to my kids who were like in the third and second grade, and I had a whiteboard and a marker, and I could draw really fast. Well, not everyone's going to be able to draw really fast, right? So we wanted to provide those resources for people. They're all on our website under the teaching resources. You can see you can download all that stuff for free. The point is we've got to jump in and be early adopters of this visually native generation, or guess what? The people who are doing this are going to have the most influence with them.
That's for sure. Again, small group curriculum. You have the Cold Case Christianity curriculum set, Forensic Faith curriculum set. All you really need to know is just make your way to coldcasechristianity.com or just type in the name J. Warner Wallace. That'll get you there as well. It's always a delight to have you on the program, and so thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks, brother. I appreciate you. Merry Christmas.
Yes, we will see you again and look forward to the next opportunity. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to move from the area of apologetics to worldview. They're actually very connected, and we'll be talking with Christian Overman, and that's coming up in just a minute. Visit the website, pointofview.net. You will find all sorts of links to all of these issues right here at pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, I want to spend just about a half an hour, if I can, talking with our good friend, Dr. Christian Overman. He's been on the program many times with us before. And let me just again encourage you to find out more about his organization. As you go to our website, pointofview.net, you can click on the button that will then take you to Worldview Matters, but you can simply go to biblicalworldview.com. And one of the many things I appreciate about Chris Overman is the fact that he writes a blog that comes out usually on Fridays. And there's some great material, and today we're going to talk about a couple of things. One, which we've mentioned before, about Indonesia. Why is it there are so many Muslims in Indonesia when we used to have Christian missionaries there? And then move to a more recent one, which came out, why is Christianized Africa so poor today? Now, when you talk about Africa and Indonesia, they seem like very different continents, and they are. And we're, in one case, talking about the gospel. In the other case, we're talking about poverty. But in a few minutes, I think you're going to see how these really relate to this idea that so often we have sort of this truncated gospel, this truncated view of Christian worldview. And if there's one thing that has really been kind of the heart and mission of Christian Overman, it is the idea that worldview should apply to every area of life. He has 2 bachelor's degrees, as well as a master of education, as well as a doctor of ministry degree. And as we've also mentioned in the past, also as a commissioned centurion, who has actually done quite a bit of work in that regard. And for those of you listening right now, I hope that maybe even some of you, because we've put this later in the program day, maybe even our teachers that are listening to this, I think you would benefit from some of the great material at Worldview Matters. But first of all, Dr. Christian Overman, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's great to be here.
Let's, if we can, kind of work our way through a couple. And again, I would encourage people to just subscribe to your blog, because every week there's something, and I say, okay, I can't bring you on every week. Well, I could, I suppose, but you got things to do too. But let me go back to one we talked about a while back, but I wanted to re-emphasize that, and that is that when you look at Indonesia, it is a place where you have the largest number of Muslims, more Muslims in the country of Indonesia than any country in the world. Okay. But then you ask an Indonesian Christian why the country was so predominantly Muslim, and a lot of it had to do with the differences between the mindset of Christian missionaries and the mindset of Muslims. Explain, if you might.
Well, Indonesia is an interesting situation because it's so far removed from the birthplace of Islam. But when the Christian missionaries came, largely actually from Holland, their tactic was to create places of worship, churches, and invite people in, so to speak. Of course, they were out witnessing as well, but the big difference between the Christian missionaries and the Muslims was that Muslims came as traders. They came as business people. And when they came with the idea that their faith is all-encompassing, which includes business. And when they came, they interacted with the people as business people, traders and whatnot. And their faith was known through their work.
Right.
And I think that's a really critical point here. 87% of Indonesia claims to be Muslim today, and that's in contrast to 7% claim to be Protestants and 3% claim to be Catholics. But if you add the Protestants and the Catholics, it's 10%, whereas almost 90% claim to be Muslims. And yet that country is so far removed from the Middle East. But trade was a key point there, and that view that to the Muslim concept of faith, that it was all-inclusive and included their business as well.
Well, and again, one of the things that you talk about in your piece, which we've posted and people can find by just typing in either your name or not part of the Muslim mindset or whatever, was this idea of the sacred secular divide. And anytime anybody's ever heard Christian Overman speak, you talk about the fact that there are so many in the past and even in the present who see that the gospel is only the gospel for personal salvation. And so when you have this idea that, okay, we'll establish the church and you come to our church, a lot of them didn't. But if instead you say, no, this idea of Christianity, or in the case of Islam, the idea of Islam is an all-encompassing faith, you can see that when you pit an all-encompassing faith against one which is kind of narrow and divided from the sacred and secular divide, and so the sacred is separated from the secular world, you can see which one wins. 87% are Muslim. Go ahead.
Yeah. A business real biblical Christianity is all-inclusive, and I'm constantly reminded of the fact that the word gospel doesn't just refer to personal salvation. Yes, that is good news, but when you look at the word gospel in the Scripture, oftentimes it's the gospel of the kingdom, and the kingdom is over all. And in fact, 1 Chronicles 29:11 says, "Your kingdom is over all." And in the New Testament, Acts 10:36, where it says Jesus is Lord of all. And that all is all-inclusive. There's not a square inch that he isn't the Lord of. He created it all. He sustains it all. He has a purpose for it all. And if we separate ourselves from the all and we just focus in on the spiritual life, we're missing out ourselves on what authentic Christianity really is. But worse than that, we are also helping others to not see the full context of true truth, which included business and commerce and all that these Muslims were doing in Indonesia.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to look at the article we've posted today, which is a more recent one. Why is Christianized Africa so poor today? And this one is interesting as well, because if you travel to Africa, you hear Christian music and you have a sense in which there is certainly a Christian culture, but yet there is still poverty there. And so what, again, does that relate to this sacred secular divide? And as we're going to a break, let me just encourage you to go to Biblical Worldview Matters .blog, or just to go to christianworldview.com. And that biblicalworldview.com resources, you'll also find some great books, which we've talked about in the past with Christian Overman, The Lost Purpose for Learning, which, again, I commend to those of you in Christian education. God's Pleasure at Work, and there's even a curriculum that goes with that. And, of course, an earlier book that he has written, which is entitled Assumptions That Affect Our Lives. So there's just some great resources there. There's some slide presentations. There's a teacher's toolbox, just a lot of great material that I would hope that you would take advantage of. But when we come back, we're going to talk about this Christianized Africa, but yet we still have poverty. And is that maybe due again to a truncated gospel and maybe an acceptance of this sacred secular divide? So we're going to continue our conversation. And if you want to go to the website, to biblicalworldview.com, we have a link to it on our website, or you could go to it directly. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Life expectancy for Americans continues to decline. The latest report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention put the bad news in perspective. The researchers say that this is the longest sustained decline in expected lifespan at birth in a century. At the turn of the last century, American men were fighting in World War I, and back home, other Americans were confronting the worst flu epidemic in modern history. Last year, there were more deaths than the previous year. That partially reflects the fact that the nation is growing older and aging, but the focus of our attention should be on the younger age groups that are also dying due to such things as suicide and drug overdoses. If you look at the top 10 leading causes of death, only the cancer rate fell in 2017. There were increases in 7 others: suicides, strokes, diabetes, Alzheimer's, flu and pneumonia, chronic lower respiratory diseases, and unintentional injuries. The greatest concern, at least for me, are the deaths due to despair. The suicide rate has increased over the last few decades for both men and women, but the increase in suicides among men has been even more dramatic. Along with that has been the significant increase in the number of deaths due to drug overdoses. In previous commentaries, I've documented that more Americans die from drug overdoses each year than all the men who died during the entire Vietnam War. Remember that these deaths of despair are taking place during peace and prosperity. We aren't engaged in a major war. We aren't in the midst of a recession. In fact, most Americans are doing much better economically. I believe Christians must preach the gospel like never before and provide hope and an eternal perspective to so many Americans who may be the next death of despair statistics. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the things we talk about so often on this program, whether it's with Nancy Piercy or Christian Overman or a variety of others, is this idea of this sacred secular divide, this idea that Christianity relates to my private life, maybe my family life, maybe, of course, my church life, but as soon as I begin to step out of my home, I go into the workplace, I go into the voting booth, I go into the courtroom. I really need to leave that behind. And that's not what Christianity is. And yet we have this kind of idea that the gospel is for personal salvation. I get my ticket to heaven, then I go and live my life pretty much the way I want to live it. And I think one of the articles that really kind of brings this back home is one that came out by Worldview Matters, written by Dr. Christian Overman, entitled, "Why is Christianized Africa So Poor Today?" And Chris, you start off with David Livingstone giving a speech at Cambridge and talks about opening Africa for commerce and the gospel. The two pioneers of civilization, Christianity and commerce, should never be inseparable. I know some people reading that go, what? How does the idea of commerce or the economy or economic ideas or even poverty relate to preaching the gospel? And yet he understood that. I think the Pilgrims might have understood that, but a lot of missionaries that came to Africa apparently did not. Explain.
Well, yeah, apparently they didn't get the memo or they didn't hear the podcast, whichever, I don't know. But, yeah, it is kind of startling to hear someone like David Livingstone, who's probably the most famous missionary that ever went to Africa, to say.
Okay, well, again, we lost him, so we'll do our best to come back. But again, David Livingstone talking about, again, this missionary to Africa. in which he said, a prospect is now before us, opening Africa for commerce and the gospel. Providence has been preparing the way. Those two pioneers of civilization, Christianity and commerce, should never be inseparable, and Englishmen should be warned by the fruits of neglecting that principle. And then one of the things that Christian Overman does is go on and talk a little bit about how the Pilgrims, when they came to the New World in the 1600s, understood that under the leadership of John Winthrop, the Puritans established what was called the Massachusetts Bay Company, which by 1640, interestingly enough, was a thriving business. And the Moravians in the next century also understood the relationship between Christianity and commerce. And if nothing else, we're finding more and more of those situations in which, if nothing else, those two sort of come together. So one of the things that Christian Overman talked about in his piece was, when he goes to, I'll use Kenya as one of his examples, he said there are three things that really impressed him. Number one, that there's Christian music pumped over the public address system at the airport. Number two, that there is church after church after church along the roadway from Nairobi to the Rift Valley. And number three, ubiquitous poverty. He says, I mean ubiquitous. And so one of the things that we see is, again, this idea of this truncated gospel, if nothing else, is something that has certainly surfaced time and time again, where we don't see the relationship, obviously, between the gospel and commerce. I think we have Chris Overman back again. So I was just talking about the fact that when you've gone to Africa, you've been struck by the fact that you hear Christian music on the public address system in the airport, churches everywhere, but poverty. And part of that is there isn't this connection between the gospel, if you will, and developing your skills within a Christian world and life view. Tell us more.
Yeah, so my experience in Africa is in Kenya, and I don't know if you go to a lot of countries where you hear Christian music pumped over the intercom system at the international airport, but you'll hear it in Kenya. And if you drive through the country, you'll find churches everywhere. And yet there's also this ubiquitous poverty, and it makes you wonder why. And I do think that a lot of it has to do with that sacred-secular divide. There's this feeling that if you're really mature and spiritual, you're going to quit your job and, get a Bible and go out and preach and, quote, live by faith. And there's something about work, I think, that has been a disconnect with a lot of us. And I'm going to speak from my own personal experience, thinking that somehow work is part of the curse, when in reality work was created for us before sin entered the scene, and Adam and Eve were tending and keeping the garden. God gave them work to do. In fact, if you dig into that first chapter, it's very clear that God had work in mind when he created us. He said, let us make man in our likeness and image, and let them rule over the fish and the birds and the whole earth, which includes minerals and water and air and everything else. So we're really here with a job description to work. And now our work is made more difficult through sin and the fall, that's for sure. But work itself is not a curse. It's a God thing. God himself works. And right from the beginning, we see that he was working. Jesus said, I've been working, doing whatever my Father tells me to do, right up to the moment he was talking. And so we tend to think, though, that work is somehow of the world. And I think that's a big, big misconception. Work is of God, and we ought to do it well as unto him. In fact, Paul, who was a tent maker himself, said, do your work. And by the way, when he said, do your work heartily as unto the Lord, he was actually talking to slaves at that point.
Yes.
And who had no idea what they were going to be doing next week, possibly, because they just did what their masters told them to do. And yet Paul says, look, realize this, that you're working for Christ. He's your real employer. I said, look, do it heartily, because Jesus is your real employer. Somehow we've missed that message, and we think, well, I'm going to go to work. I just have to do that to pay the bills and live in this life until I get to heaven. It's a necessity, but I'm not really going to embrace it as God's purpose for me unless I'm working as a pastor or a missionary. And I had that idea growing up myself. I don't know where I got it. I don't recall anybody preaching it that bluntly, but I picked it up between the lines. Somehow in Africa, and not just in Africa, by the way, even in the United States, there is this disconnect.
Yes.
Our worldview doesn't put this material world in the same category as the immaterial world, and yet the Bible says he's Lord of all, both the material and the immaterial. And we forget sometimes that he's Lord of the kitchen, he's Lord of Microsoft. Microsoft may not know that he's Lord of Microsoft, but he's Lord of everything. And even if people don't acknowledge him as the Lord of electricity and computers, and he's holding all that stuff together by the word of his power, he is. And nothing exists apart from him. So everything those Microsoft folk are working with is God's stuff. This is his world. And he wants us to manage it and to do something. I love what Chuck Colson, he said, on the sixth day God created human beings and commanded them to pick up where he left off. That is the joy of a biblical worldview applied. Apparently that message didn't get through not only to people in Africa, but a ton of people here in the United States as well. But in Africa, it's kind of sad because there hasn't been this combination of Christianity and commerce, which Livingston said, hey, here's an opportunity Providence has brought to us. Let's make the most of this and let's do the job. Somehow it just didn't quite connect.
Well, again, this is some material that you can find. Of course, we have the particular blog post here, Why Christianized Africa is Poor, but we also have a link to biblicalworldview.com. And if you find yourself saying, well, okay, what's the antidote? One of those could be the book, which is written by Dr. Christian Overman, God's Pleasure at Work. And they have a curriculum that involves a PDF, 50 video clips, all sorts of other guides, as well as other material, a facilitator's guide. So this would be something you might want to think about if you're looking for a curriculum as you come into 2019. That's a resource that is available there as well. So Christian Overman, always great to have you with us on Point of View, and Merry Christmas, and thank you for reminding us that there is no divide between sacred and secular. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Kirby. God bless you.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some of the issues in the news before we wind down the program today, and wanted you once again to hear about the great work being done there at Worldview Matters. But we do have a few things. Again, the Mueller investigation is one, as well as just the way in which the media has been covering Christians, and a couple of, if you will, corrections in some misinformation that has been making its way out on Twitter. There's a lot of it, actually, so we'll only pick out 2 or 3. We'll be back right after this.
The leader looked around the table, motioning to the older men. He said, "You're here to remind us how faithful God has been in the past. Now, you middle-aged guys, you keep us focused on what God is doing right now. Make sure we don't stop. And you younger guys, keep us looking forward. Imagine what God wants us to be doing in the years to come." There's a lot of wisdom there. We have to be thankful for the past, focused on the present, and mindful to plan for a great future. Many listeners have made bold moves to partner with Point of View Radio and accomplish great things for more than 45 years. But as we look around, we do see many positive things, and I think we can all admit there's a lot more to be done. It's time to think about your next bold move, what you can do to invest for our nation's future. Be thinking about that. If you have an answer now, don't wait. Visit pointofview.net and invest to help us enter 2019 strong. If you're not quite ready, please pray and get ready to make your next bold move. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Last half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, the last hour we spent some time talking about apologetics, and one of the people I mentioned, Melissa Kane Travis, will be with us this hour tomorrow. She is a professor at Houston Baptist and one of the leading kind of female apologists, although there's two or three really excellent ones. I mentioned just a few minutes ago one of those individuals. And so she will be with us in the second hour of our broadcast. And then we'll be talking later in the week with all sorts of other individuals. Grant Skelton, who's been with us before as our roundtable, he's got a new book out about millennials. On Wednesday, of course, we do have our millennial roundtable, but joining us for that second hour, interestingly enough, will be Paul Baraka. He has been with us before, talking about not only discipleship and those kinds of things, but he's also been with us in the last two trips that we've taken to Israel, and we'll be talking about the new one that we will have coming out next year. This time we're going to Israel and Rome. Last time we went to Israel and Greece, but again, we always like to give you a chance to walk where Jesus walked and to walk where Paul walked, and this is just, again, another opportunity. So we'll be talking with him also about some of the archaeological finds that we have coming out of Israel and a number of other things which just, again, just are amazing. This is a wonderful time in terms of archaeology to validate and verify the scriptures. So, again, those are all just a look at some of the things we'll be talking about this week. So I hope you'll join us all the way to Friday, which is, of course, our weekend edition. Well, as you know, we don't spend a lot of time talking about the Mueller investigation, and even as we mentioned it Friday, we had somebody call in and say, why are you reacting to it? We haven't even gotten the report. That's true. And I think Kelly Shackelford's response was a good one, and that is, okay, we don't have the report. We don't know what's going to be in it. We're waiting. But we do know that some of the things that have been done in terms of the process raise some questions. And even now, we see that there's a little bit of information trickling out, so I thought I'd mention it. But again, that's all we have. We don't have a lot to talk about, so we don't talk about it. There are other things that affect your faith, your family, and your freedom. This will be an important story later on. And frankly, if you want to know more about the Mueller investigation, there are all sorts of people on other shows speculating about it. But we do have a few things. We do have what are called the sentencing memos that have come out now by Robert Mueller's special counsel probe, which actually relate to three former members of people that have been involved with Donald Trump. And that would be Michael Flynn, who's been on the program with us before, Paul Manafort, and Michael Cohen. Now, a couple of disclosures. First of all, one was this disclosure that Michael Cohen, interestingly enough, who served as the lawyer for Donald Trump, that it said something about an unknown attempt by an unidentified Russian to reach out to the Trump presidential campaign. It specifically said in and around November 2015, Cohen received the contact information for and spoke with a Russian national who claimed to be a trusted person in the Russian Federation who could offer the campaign political synergy and synergy on a government level, unquote. That's what the memo says. That's all we got. Now, that's led just all sorts of speculation, and I'm just not going to bother with that because we'll know enough when we know what we need to know. But again, the argument that seems to be made right now is that some Russian tried to insinuate himself into the Trump campaign and nothing happened. So again, the question that our friends at the Wall Street Journal ask is, why insert that into a sentencing memo? They said the press is breathing heavily that it signals Mr. Mueller's indication or intention to promote a narrative that some of the people with Trump were all too willing for commercial or political reasons to hear Russian solicitations. If what we're talking about is something that later surfaced in June of 2016, you might remember we've talked about that before. Donald Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner took a meeting, which they shouldn't have, and it was just a disaster anyway. That's the case. And then the other part of the memo was, again, having to do with Michael Cohen, the lawyer, who, in this particular case, the memo on him from the U.S. Attorney of the Southern District of New York said that this was some kind of question about the payoff to porn actress Stormy Daniels and another woman who claimed to have an affair with Donald Trump. And in this case, I love the response comes from the editors of the Wall Street Journal. This is kind of like the movie Dumb and Dumber. I mean, after all, every voter pretty much knew that Donald Trump had a history with women. So it's not like this was new information. And so this is something else in the sentencing memo. But even if indeed there is fire where the smoke is right now, they also point out that campaign violations are often treated as civil, not criminal violations. And I'm not even sure this would be a campaign violation. But okay, just even assuming that it is, we have the Justice Department actually dropped criminal charges against the Democrat John Edwards in 2012 for payments made by campaign donors to his mistress. And, of course, interesting enough, John Edwards is kind of in the news again because they have this movie out about him. So, nevertheless, that is where we find ourselves. There's just not a lot to talk about, and yet I know there are talk shows that fill all 3 hours talking about the Mueller investigation. We're going to move on to some other things. One of those is the issue of media bias, and this comes from our good friend George Yancey, who is a professor, I should say Dr. George Yancey, at the University of North Texas. Now, he's a sociologist and has done a good job over the years of studying anti-Christian bias. That's what he's kind of known for, and he has a new book out called Prejudice in the Press that he and a colleague looked into the potential for bias, racial bias, gender bias, sexual preference bias, or religious bias. And his article that appeared in the Stream just a few days ago, I thought was helpful to understand when we talk about anti-Christian bias, it isn't that the stories aren't covered, it's the way the stories are covered. Now here he's only taken a part of the book, but here's how he set it up. He had two scenarios. One concerned the shooting of worshipers inside a religious building. Half of the respondents were told that the building was a church. The other half were told that it was a mosque, to see what difference that might make. Then they had another scenario of a professor making very hateful comments. Half were told the comments were anti-Christian, and the other half were told that the comments were anti-gay. Okay, you got the setup? So this gave you a chance to do kind of an apples-to-apples comparison. Same story, but one happens in a mosque, one happens in a church. Same professor, but in one case it's a professor making what he calls Christianophobic comments, and the other homophobic comments. He said, you might find it surprising that news organizations agreed to run these stories equally. So the issue is there was really no bias in terms of going with the story. It didn't matter whether the building was a church or a mosque. It really didn't matter if the professor said things that were anti-Christian or anti-homosexual. But that didn't mean he says there was not bias. He says instead it was a bias of a different kind. It showed up in a way the media talked about the scenarios. For example, if the story was about a shooting in a mosque, the story was all about hate crimes and religious bigotry. If the story was about a church, then the news reporters focused on the shooter instead. On the other one, if the professor was anti-gay, the media put the spotlight on hate speech and discussed whether the professor ought to be fired. If the professor said anti-Christian things, the media framed it in terms of free speech rights. And so what he goes on to say is these findings show that many in the media are closed to the idea that Christians can face unfair hatred. They believe that Christians hold the power, or so they've been told, so they don't believe there's anything such as anti-Christian bigotry. And this kind of relates to something that came out today in Robert Knight's piece, Suppressing Christianity's Historical Importance. They found in this particular survey, this one, I'll just look at the Democrats there because that's where it was most striking. They found that 68% of Democrats, or two-thirds of Democrats, said that employers should grant a request for a prayer space for Muslims. But only 45%, that is less than half, said employers should grant a similar request by Christians. So there almost tends to be a treatment of Islam different than Christianity, a treatment of mosques different than churches. So he concludes by making this statement, and we'll take a break. My colleague and I don't see this as fake news in the sense of media personnel intentionally distorting information. It's a different problem, and in some ways even harder to solve. They simply do not perceive the reality of anti-Christian hate. Conservative Christians face animosity in the United States that's just as high as Muslims face, but the media just dismisses it. They don't really see it. And he says, my prior research shows that liberals and secular individuals are more likely to have anti-Christian hatred than others. And he says, of course, it's well known in research that media personnel are relatively likely to be politically liberal and secular. And so he says, and nothing else, this explains why Christians cannot rely on the media to tell stories sympathetic to their causes. If nothing else, it's a great justification for why you need to listen to Point of View. Got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Jonas Yoder was a member of the Old Order Amish living in the state of Wisconsin. Yoder and others lived carefully according to their religious tradition in a community with other Amish and away from the influence of the modern world. After the 8th grade, Old Order Amish school children do not continue to high school where much is taught in variance with their Amish way of life. Instead, the children return to the home where they are instilled with the virtues of goodness, wisdom, and community welfare by their family. But these families ran into a problem as they sought to live out their religion that had motivated their families since the 16th century. The state of Wisconsin required students to attend school through at least the high school age of 16. Yoder's case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States that held that the state of Wisconsin could not compel these Amish families to send their children to high school. According to the court, only those interests of the highest order and those not otherwise served can overbalance legitimate claims to the free exercise of religion. Wisconsin v. Yoder was among the first cases that helped articulate an important balancing test that weighed a state's interest in governing against an individual's right to the free exercise of religion. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Students and teachers are being told that prayer, Bibles, and religion are illegal in public school, but that's not true. Learn the facts. Read your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org right now. Don't let anyone steal your freedom with bad information. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit for students and teachers at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Only for a few more minutes, and what I wanted to do real quickly is kind of just see if we could do a quick fact check on a couple of Twitter posts and things like that. Both of the individuals we're talking about are relatively young individuals, and I'm really not picking on them, but again, if they are going to present information that is just factually incorrect, and they have a Twitter account that has an incredible impact and has a lot of followers, it just, I think, is a matter of public service to see if occasionally we can just correct some of the errors being presented. No doubt you've heard the phrase, which has been attributed to Mark Twain and Thomas Jefferson and Winston Churchill and all sorts of people. We don't know who said it, but it's something like a lie travels around the globe while the truth is still trying to put its boots on. You've probably heard that before. And some of these false facts are just getting out there, and there's no truth to them. And I don't want to ever be perceived as picking on David Hogg or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're relatively young. But I guess what surprises me is that they'll say something that is just so factually incorrect. Just the other day, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post, and it doesn't seem to even affect them to say, maybe I need to check my facts next time. I mean, I remember 30-plus years ago when I started writing a newspaper column that occasionally appeared in the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Post. It was in a lot of small papers, too, the El Campo News and the Lampasas Dispatch and the Wrong Route Leader and all that. Every once in a while, somebody would point out a mistake in one of my op-eds. And I was always chastened, and I even remember sometimes thinking, should I even write the next column because, I just made a mistake there. Usually they were very small mistakes, by the way. It was picking the wrong word or maybe not putting a disclaimer to explain that I understood that, but I was trying to just make a broader point. And I just am amazed at some of these individuals that have this sort of national forum who are we keep pointing out some of the mistakes that they make. And it doesn't seem to even cause them to pull back a little bit and say, maybe I need to check my facts next time. But let me take a couple just to make the point and to say that when you read something, just because it's on a Twitter post doesn't mean it's true. And one of the reasons we post articles, as we have today, we've got articles that link to J. Warner Wallace, his blog. We have the blog post by Christian Overman. I've quoted a couple of others, and in most cases tried to tell you where you could find some of those. We want you to check them out yourself. But David Hogg has certainly had a lot of visibility because he has been perhaps the most outstanding spokesperson after the Parkland shooting. And so one of his posts the other day was just amazing. It said, Congress ought to create a federal tax on gun sales to fund gun violence research. So what he's proposing is Congress will actually put a tax on gun sales to fund research in gun violence. Now, of course, some people reacted to that, which I thought was appropriate, by saying, well, I see nothing wrong with forcing people who have done nothing wrong to foot the bill to study research which will be used in many cases to restrict our Second Amendment rights. But I thought it was even more interesting to see the reaction from one of the people at the National Rifle Association who said, it's always satisfying when an anti-gunner reveals just how uneducated they are about firearms. Recently, this distinction goes to David Hogg, who has repeatedly called for a federal tax on firearms and ammunition, which he must not realize already exists. And what's so interesting is all you have to do, just type in Google and tax on guns, and up pops up this. The firearms and ammunition excise tax was first imposed in 1919. In 1937, the Pittman-Robertson Act directed all revenue from the FAET and related excise taxes to be used for hunting-related activities. The FAET includes a 10% tax on the sale of pistols and revolvers, 11% of the sale price on other firearms and ammunition, and 11% tax on archery equipment. And since I have all of those, I've already paid those taxes on it. I didn't know there was one on archery equipment, too. Okay. The tax is applied whether or not the equipment is likely to be used for hunting. So that means, in round numbers, $12 billion, with a B, $12 billion has been collected under the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. That includes more than $761 million during the last fiscal year. And the revenues go to such things as the Wildlife Restoration Trust Fund. So there, it would be good to have a tax on guns and ammunition. Oh, excuse me, we've had one since 1919, and we've actually collected $12 billion since 1937. But there you go. Here's one more real quickly. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, we have death panels out there because we have companies that are saying that they won't cover a critical procedure or medicine. Justin Haskins put it this way. First of all, this claim that insurance companies essentially act as death panels is really not true. He says, first of all, for starters, health insurance companies are heavily regulated, some of the most heavily regulated companies in the country. And in fact, they are already forced under the Affordable Care Act to cover essential health treatments. That's emergency services, hospitalization, even some non-emergency treatments like substance abuse services. And also then states themselves have additional essential health mandates. The National Conference of State Legislatures said there are more than 1,900 such statutes among all 50 states. Another analysis tallies more than 2,200 individual state provisions adopted over a 30-year period. So first of all, that's the case. But the second point he makes is also good. Death panels, she described, aren't death panels at all. Death panels are composed of government bureaucrats or policymakers who decide which healthcare treatments will be covered in a single-payer or government-run healthcare system. The reason they have been labeled death panels is because under a single-payer plan, the government is the only insurer, which means it has complete power to decide which services will be covered, and of course, by definition, which ones will not be. He goes on to say there are other options in a single-payer system. Either the government will choose to pay for your care or it won't. But if it chooses not to, then you're out of luck, unless, of course, you're a millionaire. But in a true market-based system, if my health insurance company were to refuse to offer me a plan covering all the services I'm most concerned about, I could simply go to another health insurance insurer who would. And if enough people wanted a particular health service covered, insurers would surely offer it. That's how the market works. And, of course, the bottom line is some of the limitations there are the fact that your company oftentimes owns your health insurance policy, and that's a mistake from the beginning. Your company doesn't own your car insurance. Your company doesn't own your house insurance. Your company probably doesn't own your life insurance. But the only reason it owns your health insurance is a mistake that happened after World War II, where when there was wage and price controls, the only way that you could compete for employers sometimes was to offer them health care plans. And the more we can disconnect some of the health insurance plans from companies and allow you to make individual choices, the better off we will be. Anyway, I just wanted to take those on. Again, not trying to criticize them as individuals, but if you're going to say things in Twitter posts which have a wide exposure, and don't forget, I mentioned just the other day that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has more Twitter followers than the other 60 incoming members of Congress from the Democratic Party. So she has a huge megaphone. And so if she's going to say things that are inaccurate on that huge megaphone, somebody, and certainly we'd like to occasionally, try to answer those erroneous statements with some of the facts. If you'd like to know a little bit more, we have all of that on our website, pointofview.net. Don't forget that we're coming to year end, so if you can help us out financially, click on that button that says donate. We would greatly appreciate your financial support. Got a lot to cover tomorrow here on Point of View, and we are so grateful for the work that Andrew and Steve do behind the scenes, as well as Stephanie. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.